Hello, good morning. Today, our guest is Professor Hilton Root, and we're going to be talking about one of his newer papers titled Disruptive Innovation in the Economic Organization of China and the West. So, how are you doing, Professor Root?
Good morning. I'm doing really fine, and I'm delighted to talk to you. And I understand many of my colleagues love your uh, blog site, so I'm really looking forward to this opportunity, and especially if it takes my thinking into new directions. So I hope there's some surprising implications in our conversation.
I hope so too. But before we delve into the meat of the matter, I'm going to ask a basic question. What is a system spanning network?
So a system spanning network is if you define the boundaries of a system, then those are the connectivities that link all of the nodes in that system, usually either to a core node or to a series of hubs. So system spanning networks can take various forms. They can be a central a core periphery system, like a hub and spoke system, similar to how I described China in the article and in my work. And there you have one central core that to which all of the system level traffic is connected. And then you can have a more diffuse system of connectivity, like in the European royal networks that you mentioned in one of your questions to me. And those are hubs, and those hubs have high degree of interconnectivity with other hubs and with other nodes in the system. So what makes it system spanning is that from any point in the network, in other words, from any node in the network, you can reach any other node through the system spanning structure of it. And that system spanning structure is often referred to in mathematics as the hyper network. So the hyper network is, in effect, a higher level system that provides connectivity throughout the system. If you don't have that, then you don't really have a system. Then you just have a diffuse set of nodes, but there's no interconnectivity, so they don't have any systemic features. So when we start to talk about the systemic features of a network, those systemic features are largely derived from the structure of the hypernetwork, which is the system spanning structure of a system.
Brilliant explanation. So, Hilton, you are interested in information sharing in pre-modern societies, right?
That's
You
correct.
exactly. And in your paper, this paper, The Disruptive Innovation in the Economic Organization of China and the West, you compare different strategies of sharing information in China and Western societies. And we're going to talk briefly about royal systems in primarily Northwestern Europe. How did royal systems in Northwestern Europe promote information sharing and stability? Because this is a major aspect of the paper.
Yes. So there are two key points I'd like to make in response to your paper. One, the traditional view of the economic dynamism of Western Europe is attributes that dynamism to Europe being decentralized. But Europe is not the metaphor of decentralization is not a sufficient explanation, because it's not a completely decomposable system into separate units. In fact, it has a degree of connectivity that spans the system, which refers back to the previous conversation, and those are the royals. So the royals emerge as a cohesive group of interconnected families through dynastic marriages, and these the rules of dynastic marriage become increasingly codified, and they're not merely ceremonial. and the linkages within Europe that sustain that make it a unified cultural entity derive from these linkages of the royals, many of which are of Germanic descent. So you mentioned that the Northern Europe is where there's a higher connectivity among the royals over time, and the royals in the southern part of Europe are less connected. Well, one of the reasons for that is the Reformation. So Protestant family royals and Catholic royals would virtually never intermarry, and also the way the Catholic Church operated in Southern Europe prevented many of the, I would say, economic or growth abetting properties of the system to accrue as compared to Northern Europe. So let me just add one further point, that historians generally view the royals as remnants of the old regime. They generally view royal families as residual. And my study, and there are others as well, are pointing to the fact that this is hardly true at all. The royals are extremely dynamic. They're extremely adaptive. If they're not adaptive, their lineage will either be erased completely, or will not be able to make the key essential marriages with partners and alliances that would enable it to grow and to expand in power. So the system grows by royals acquiring more nodes and linkages. So the royal families want to have as many connections with other royal families, especially those royal families out of themselves hubs and that are highly connected. So there's this enormous competition within Europe to in the royal marriage market, and many of the boundaries, especially the cultural boundaries of Europe, actually can be attributed to these the persistence of these royal networks. So if you look at the actual national identities of Europe today, they are actually derivative of this royal network, which basically segmented Europe into regional identities, cultural identities. This segmentation is, of course, a source of conflict, but it's also a source of fertility in terms of ideas, fusion of ideas from different pockets of Europe to other parts of Europe, from different corners of Europe to other corners of Europe. And all of that was facilitated by not only the royals' intermarriages, but the many institutions that the royals patronized that enabled the spread of technologies, the spread of music, spread of cultural norms, spread of styles, fashion, even languages. All of this would percolate along these royal networks. But the other key point that I make in the book, also in the article that you're referring to, there's also a book that I wrote several years ago on the same topic, is that because of the many royal families and the many regional identities and regional institutions that proliferated and thrived in this environment, it would be very difficult to suppress ideas that came from one part of Europe and prevent their spread into other parts. So this makes the royal network actually facilitates the spread of disruptive ideas across the system. And it means that in order to survive, the royals have to be extremely adaptive and extremely proactive in managing the new technologies and new ideas. If they were to try to prevent the spread of new ideas into their regions, they would often cause the region to become backward and to cause and to depreciate or to devalue or diminish their connectivities, and therefore they become less essential, less central to the system. So there's a kind of logic that I try to explain in the paper of how the system grows through the acquisition of connectivities, and that enabled the liberties of various secondary institutions or corporate institutions to thrive, because there was a competition between royal families and other elites, including aristocratic families, to be the patrons of various corporate bodies. And these bodies often were the precursors of democratic practices and of cultural cooperation. So monarchs would become the patron, let's say, of a guild, and by doing so, they have connections to a city that can be valuable for their for purposes of resource extraction or influence spreading. But at the same time, these corporate bodies that receive royal patronage, they themselves are able to thrive, and they become units of self-governance, and that they have both institutional and cultural implications for the development of European society.
Hilton, is decentralization the reason for the innovative dynamism of European royals in contrast to the conservatism of Chinese royals? Because European royals have a long history of political entrepreneurship, Frederick of Prussia, Peter the Great, Catherine the Great, etc. So why are European royals so willing to respond to public changes? Even today, the Queen of Denmark, she's serious about restructuring the monarchy, so she has decided to strip some of her grandchildren of their titles.
Yes, the monarchs are always, so to speak, on the move. They're always trying to be ahead of the trends, or they don't want to fall behind. Uh, that has continued to be the case. But let me go back to this decentralization theme. So yes, much of the literature, the predominant literature on European development, emphasizes the decentralized nature and the competitive nature of these decentralized units as a stimulus to innovation, as a stimulus to accepting novelty, and as a stimulus to economic growth. But what is lacking in that, it's not, there's nothing wrong with that statement, but there needs to be a capstone on that statement that says these decentralized units were able to achieve a hyper network level of cooperation that strung this together and actually accelerated the process of economic dynamism and cultural integration. And so so I add to the theme of decentralization, which is fundamental to understanding Europe's difference from China, the notion that there is this body hyper network, the hyper network linkages among these interconnected families, and that this spreads through the whole system and provides connectivity throughout the system. And the church is, of course, another one of these hyper networks that unify the cultural boundaries of Europe. China is a different model, also a model that has an enormous historical pedigree, but it's one in which the core is unified around the imperial dynasty, and a central administration is created and is populated or recruited through a meritocratic system. So instead of having these linked families, you have a central core with supported by a bureaucratic network of officials who are selected through an examination system. And this examination system is what enables both connectivity and, to a certain degree, an impartiality that allows the unification of Chinese culture, but makes it something fundamentally different. The system logic of growth and connectivity is completely different from the European one.
Yes, I find the story of European monarchies to be quite fascinating. As you said earlier, they usually they seem to be on the go. Joseph Levine, he wrote a book arguing that in society there's often a struggle for supremacy between the moderns and the ancients, and in the West, the moderns often triumph.
Yeah, I don't know that particular book, so it would be
Yeah,
difficult for me to.
it's quite it seems to be quite obscure, but
Well,
it's an interesting read, an interesting topic. But back to China,
yes.
why were dynastic crises less evident in China?
So Chinese dynasties had considerable longevity. Many of them endured for 250 years, uh, even 300 years in some cases. Um, the the monarchs, the emperors, were able to acquire large harems from which they could breed many potential successors. So the main cause of warfare in Europe in the early modern, pre-modern period is usually succession crisis. Crisis occurs when there's no male heir, there's only a female heir, and then that leads to disputes and often military uh, confrontation or military. These disputes are resolved through often warfare. Some of it becomes long wars that last for many years. Also, a feature of European life that has no exact parallel in China. The wars tend to be very intense, very large, but very short-lived. Um, but to go back to this question, so the succession, um, the, so because of the abundance of potential successors, there of course is conflict among these potential successors, but the imperial dynasty has a choice, and therefore it doesn't lead to a military confrontation. It's a palace dispute. Uh, but the problem, of course, is the installation of the monarchy over time, and that as the monarchs become more and more insulated from society, they tend to make either poor policy choices or become unaware of the erosion of loyalty or the erosion of the tax base or the diversion of taxes to local landlords or local warlords or the so dynastic crises, when they do occur in China, are far more severe in terms of their social and economic consequences because they are, first of all, system wide. They often result in enormous death, breakdown of the system. So once the central hub that holds the whole system together is removed or damaged, then the linkages among the subnetworks deteriorate very quickly. They don't have linkages among themselves. Their linkages are through the center. So the disruption of the central node, either through a succession crisis or war or simply state capacity failures or mismanagement failures, any of these can lead to a disaster, a major empire-wide disaster. So you get Chinese growth during periods of stability is very substantial and very incremental in the sense that there's an enormous aggregation of incremental innovations. But when you get these dynastic breakdowns, then you have enormous disruption, and then the system has to readapt itself or reconstruct itself And what's very interesting is that from the Han Dynasty onward, the structure of the dynasty, the fundamental governing structures tend to be replicated, with some, of course, innovations. But it remains a hub and spoke system. It remains a system of a meritocratic examination-based officialdom. And those traditions, many people believe, persist into the cultural values of contemporary China.
Another interesting point. So we're going to speak more deeply about China. But before we do so, I'm going to ask a question related to the bureaucracy in China. How did the state bureaucracy promote information sharing in China?
So the state bureaucracy is chosen through a meritocratic system, and to a great extent, those examinations are based on the Confucian texts that are disseminated and provide a basis of common knowledge, common expectations, and a common morality for the ruling elite. And on the basis of that, there is the capability to reach decisions, evaluations, assessments using a common criteria among a cohesive elite that will have a similar, basically the same education. So when it comes to processing information, they have the same analytical tools, they have the same methodological perspectives, they have the same moral perceptions, they have the same values, and so they can act in a fairly cohesive manner as a group. They can even change their views very quickly once a new perspective is adopted at the center. It can diffuse very quickly through the system. There are about 1,300 of these Confucian administrators spread throughout China at different hierarchical levels, and the levels are replicated in each administrative district. So there's also a fairly cohesive, unified administrative structure that is the same in each region, or within each subdivision, with each administrative subdivision. So that enables information to be processed at lower levels and to be passed to senior levels. What the system fails to do is to establish strong interconnectivity across regions. So information diffuses from the bottom to the top, but it diffuses hierarchically and not horizontally. The diffusion of information is essentially vertical. And that, of course, is another weakness of the system, in that while disruptive technologies can be stopped from diffusing, and alarms can go out that such a technology may be system damaging or threatening to political stability. So you have the ability to filter both positive and both in a positive way, filter innovations, diffuse them, but also stop ones from spreading that could be viewed by the ruling elite as potentially damaging to system cohesion. And this is why they also complemented this capacity with control over the major technologies that could be used for warfare, such as iron smelting, such as coal. So through the control of key and key technologies, they were able to ensure that weapon dissemination didn't occur to groups that would have rebellious tendencies. Therefore, they are both able to sustain the system over long periods of time, but they're not able to keep up with the pace of technological change in Europe, ultimately, which is driven by disruptive innovations. And in China, those innovations that have been deemed disruptive, and many of them originated actually in China, or the Chinese invented them first, such as the printing press. We know that they dismantled a remarkable navy that they had in the 15th century because it posed a threat to the regime. They did not allow Chinese merchants to have access to international trade routes. They prefer to use foreigners, especially Iranians on the Silk Road routes. They they prefer to minimize the development of sub-networks that would be in parallel to the state. So in effect, they actually reduce connectivities throughout the society.
Professor Root, what was the role of lineage systems in China?
I'm very glad you asked that question, because that's another actually key uh, part of Chinese political order and of economic order. The lineage system had primacy at local levels of social organization, and it was bolstered by Confucian morality. So you had this system spanning Confucian elites, officialdom, that provided a national system of communication, information sharing, and of revenue management. But at the local levels, it was the lineage system and lineage organizations that are built around the theme of ancestral worship that control the local decision making and at the village and sub-village level. And so, unlike Western Europe, where the Catholic Church undertook a systematic effort through the control of marriage to eliminate lineages and to encourage the formation of nuclear families and to prevent cousin marriages, and there was no cultural manager that was system-wide throughout China. So the lineage, and this means the lineage leaders, the tribal elders or village elders, would have primacy over the decision making, over the resource allocation, over the care for the poor. All of the managerial responsibilities at the local level were handled through lineage networks. So you get very high levels of trust within the lineage, but high levels of mistrust for individuals or groups that are outside of your lineage. So you have strong interlineage cooperation, but very much an in and out system where the people who are outsiders have few linkages. And so when you look at the building of financial networks in China, they're almost entirely built on basis of family connections, of family interlinkages. So you don't have the ability to pool resources from groups outside of your lineage group. And of course, this puts a ceiling on the growth of private organizations. And it also means that you don't have a generalized morality, have more of a localized morality based on people you actually know. So this is where the concept that Chinese scholars often refer to, guanxi, relationship-based interactions in trade, in community management, in deal making in general, and it's also persistent into the present. It's characteristic of Chinese commerce, guanxi, and the bad side of guanxi, or I could say the deleterious side of guanxi, is that it leads to patron-client relations between state and society. And so here's the real dilemma that China faces throughout its history. You have the elite, which is guided by impartial Confucian metrics for its decision-making and its thinking, but they depend for operationalizing their policy objectives on lineage groups at the village level, at the local level, the town and ship level. And so the values of the lineage system inevitably pervade into and spill into the working of the bureaucracy and compromises it. And it results in the salience of patron-client relations, uh, and the the officials depend on the lineage system to get things done. So inevitably, they have to compromise their standards of objectivity to accomplish their local goals, which means bribe taking, privileging certain families over others. So you get into a systemic kind of syndrome of corruption, uh, because there's no intermediary linkages between the networks of families and the network of royal imperial administrators.
All right, so we have enough on lineages, and I must say that lineages are still powerful in China today, and even today in China, officials associated with the Communist Party are still placed in big companies. So there's still a link between lineage societies, the government, and entrepreneurship in China today. Two more, these are my last 2 points. One, you argue in your paper that European royals, they promoted modernization by working with assemblies, and if they did not, they would ultimately meet their demise. That was a question in the email, and this will be our last point. There is a paradox, Hilton. You said that you want this interview to lead to new research, and this will be your new research. The imperial paradox. It is said that empires are stable, but China, despite being an enduring empire, had a relatively low level of state capacity during some periods. It was difficult for the empire to administer taxes and to really manage the bureaucracy. So if empires are so stable, why did China experience the crisis of low capacity in so many different eras? That's your new topic to research.
That's a wonderful topic.
Yes,
Yes,
Debin Ma has written on the topic.
yes.
Japan was the more decentralized society, and apparently the Japanese were able to respond to new norms quicker than the Chinese, and also at a higher level of state capacity. So if China is so stable and institutions are enduring, even today they're still enduring, what accounts for the low level of state capacity?
Oh, it's interesting that you should mention Devin Ma, because I'm actually going to be seeing him this weekend at a conference in Manchester on the Chinese economy, history of the Chinese economy. So I look forward to taking that topic up with him. And he's absolutely correct that there is a crisis of state capacity, in particularly the fact that it's very difficult for the state to increase its revenue, and therefore, as population increases, the size of bureaucracy doesn't increase in proportion, and so the state is able to do less and less and depends in more and more on the lineage system. So the lineage leaders become more independent. They are more of the modernization of the country depends on the lineage rather than on the effectiveness of the bureaucracy. The bureaucracy becomes very ineffective, and the lineage system, of course, corrupts and limits the amount of cooperation that there can be across lineages. So these themes are very connected, and Japan could, as he said, respond more readily. The Japanese political system, in many ways, was more similar to that of Europe, with there were many sub networks, particularly the samurai, and these were aristocratic retainers who had relative autonomy. So you mentioned the parliaments, and the fact and the irony that has always been apparent to European historians, that those kings that ruled with parliament rather than against parliament lasted longer and were also wealthier, and in the end more successful. And these these kings who ruled with parliament tended to be clustered in the northwest quadrant of Europe. The ones who tried to disable or weaken parliaments ended up themselves weakened, and in the case of the French monarchy, completely abolished. So that's a tremendously important theme in European history, and the part of it that intrigues me the most is the degree to which kings that rule through parliament also rule through the legal system, rule through law. And the parliament was, of course, a source of legislative legislative rights and legitimacy. And that enhanced the royal capacity, and it also enhanced state capacity. So that's the channel. The channel is really the legal system, and the way in which the kings of Europe use the legal system to increase state capacity and to enhance their own legitimacy. Whereas in China, the system remained a personalized system, and in which the state ended up dependent on personal ties, personal linkages with lineage leaders. And of course, this was a source of permanent weakness, and it led to a crisis of state capacity. So thank you for giving me this topic, because in fact, it's very, very much intriguing. And I hope that this weekend I'll have a chance to discuss it with
Yes, all right. And before I go, we must say that the end of history is inapplicable to China. The Chinese can adapt and resist at the same time. As you said in your paper, the Chinese can be receptive to Western norms. However, this does not prevent them from preserving Asian traditions and conservative ideology. So the end of history is inapplicable for the Chinese.
Yes, I think the end of history has proven to be, as a metaphor of global historical change, it has not stood the test of time. And the Chinese counterexample has more or less made it an idea that has not been that has not stood the test of time, quite simply. And that's why I introduce an alternative framework, a complex system and complex economics framework to understand these large-scale historical change processes and the persistence of traditions that don't have the convergence theme of the end of history. So I absolutely agree with you that the big challenge for people trying to understand global historical change is to move away from this end of history and to supplement it or come up with an analytical framework that is equally applicable to the Western experience and the Chinese experience. And that's what I've tried to do, both in this article and in my book, Network Origins of the Global Economy, which appeared in 2020.
All right. So thanks again for showing up.
Well, thank you so much. It's been a great pleasure chatting with you, and hopefully we'll get another opportunity.
And say hello to Debbie. I've been wanting to interview him for some time.
Oh, okay. Well, should I ask him to get in touch with you?
Yes, yes.
I'll do that.
All right.
Great.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you very much. Have a great day. Bye-bye.